On this day, January 7th, in 1789, the electors for the first presidential election in American history were selected. We all know who won that first election, and all of George Washington's fellow founding fathers knew who was going to win. The reason Washington was first in the hearts of his countrymen was that he put those countrymen, his fellow citizens, and his country first. Washington said, "The Constitution is the guide which I never will abandon." It was for that reason that he is properly esteemed for who he is. George Washington understood what we today too often forget, that the federal government must be responsible to the American people, not for them. It must protect our liberty. It must do so, Washington knew, by protecting us against external threats. And insofar as we enfeeble our nation's ability to ensure our country's security, we endanger our liberty. By limiting government's size and reach, citizens help to ensure that it will do the things that it must do. That is why we have titled today's talk, "It's Not Just the Economy, Stupid." Our speaker today, Brian Kennedy, understands the threats that our nation faces today. Mr. Kennedy is president of the Claremont Institute. Its mission is to restore the principles of the American founding to their rightful, preeminent authority in our national life. President of Claremont Institute's excellent quarterly publication, the Claremont Review of Books, Mr. Kennedy also is director of the Institute's Ballistic Missile Defense Project. He has written widely on national security issues in the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and Investor's Business Daily, among other publications. He also sits on the Independent Working Group on Missile Defense. Brian Kennedy has spoken for Hillsdale College on many occasions. We're pleased to welcome him today for the first time to Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming Brian Kennedy.
Thank you, David, for that very kind introduction. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. It's a great honor to be here for Hillsdale College. I share with Hillsdale students something important. I, like them, are a student of Hillsdale President Larry Arnn, who has been a friend and colleague of mine for 20 years. He hired me 20 years ago at the Claremont Institute. And I'm proud to say the same thing of Doug Jeffrey, who many of you know, who is in the back of the room there. Doug is the quiet and indispensable intellectual behind the best parts of the conservative movement, whether it's been at Hillsdale College or at the Claremont Institute. Thank you, Doug, for having me. Well, as was said by David, I have the pleasure of serving as president of the Claremont Institute. Our mission is to make these first principles you hear so much about these days, these first principles of the American founding, preeminent again in our politics, to make them matter, not just to say them, but to make them a reality. As a practical matter, my colleagues and I remind, alert, and otherwise explain to the most important Americans, including all of you, that their freedom can be lost, that the prosperity and domestic tranquility our country enjoys can all be taken away, that in the great history of the world, no country like ours lasts forever, and certainly not a democratic republic like ours. Lost because we have enemies who would like to see our way of life destroyed, because it is we Americans that represent freedom in the modern world. Now, on the airplane here from California, I sat next to a very fine chap, a Christian minister who was coming here to Washington. I asked him what he was going to be doing while he was here. "Spreading the good news of Jesus," he said. He asked what I was going to be doing. I told him, "Spreading the bad news of Brian." Because I think our situation today is much more serious than our elected leaders would let us believe. Abraham Lincoln called us the last best hope of earth. We are that, to be sure, but we as a people don't always appreciate this. We are a blessed people, blessed to be here in North America, protected by two oceans, and with neighbors in Canada and Mexico that we have been very careful to cultivate these past 200 years. Some of us, like those in this room, are aware that we have permanent enemies, enemies that are capable, more capable than ever, of seeing us destroyed. Well, I'd like to begin with the question, indeed the only question we should be asking when it comes to our national defense. Can America and the free world actually be destroyed? Do we have threats to our very existence? That even in these tough economic times, when we're so worried about how to create jobs, must we not also worry about our national defense? We are told that we are the most powerful military in the world and that we will have no serious challenge for some time to come. And we are comforted with three reassurances meant to end serious discussion about national security policy. You know these reassurances well. They are, first, that Islam is a religion of peace. Second, that we will never go to war with China because our economic interests are so intertwined. And third, and perhaps the most controversial, that America won the Cold War and that Russia is no longer our enemy. Now, these myths are propagated on the left and right, and we would like to believe them because to believe otherwise would suggest we have enemies who seek our destruction, our marginalization, or our subjugation. Now, let me say transparently the unfashionable thing and say we, in fact, do have enemies in the Islamic world, in Russia and in communist China. They operate abroad and here in the United States. Now, you will know from reading Aristotle and your own common sense that everything is done for a purpose. In world politics, states often do what is in their interest. When they go through elaborate planning, spend enormous treasure, requisition men and materials, and organize them for a purpose, then we know that statecraft is at work. Today we must understand who our enemies are and take the necessary steps to defend these United States, or we will suffer the consequences. These consequences may be the end of the American way of life, constitutional government, or the very lives of the American people. It would be much easier to tell you all to go and listen to your iPods or go on Facebook and go shopping or watch 300 channels of cable TV. I can't. That wouldn't be right. You all in this room are too important for that. You have a responsibility to know better, to do something about it, to do something before it is too late. That is the way of a Hillsdale student. That is the way of others in this room that have made it their business to work to defend this country and its principles. Now let me address three areas of confusion in our current understanding of our national defense. These are, as I say, the Islamic threat, communist China, and Russia. First, Islam is a religion of peace. We were told this after the attacks of September 11th, after Islamic operatives hijacked and flew planes into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and were thwarted before hitting another target here in Washington, probably not very far from here. Now, President Bush was a very good man, and he believed or was otherwise persuaded that Islam was no different than a strain of the Judeo-Christian heritage, that its adherents, the Islamic adherents, were peaceful, decent people who abhorred what happened September 11th. President Bush even said on October 11th, 2002, that Islam is a vibrant faith. Millions of our fellow citizens are Muslim. We respect the faith. We honor its traditions. Our enemy does not. Our enemy doesn't follow the great traditions of Islam. They've hijacked a great religion. End of quote. Now, in this very partisan town, it's common to circle the wagons and support the president when he is thought to have conservative leanings. And even today, since we know that President Bush was such an otherwise decent man. But Mr. Bush and his administration did the country a great disservice by saying that Islam was a religion of peace, for it was trying to understand them as we would like them to be, rather than how they in fact are. Although Islam is organizationally built around a belief in God, whom they call Allah, Islam is more properly, for the purposes of our discussion, a political ideology organized around the Quran and the teachings of its founder, Muhammad. Its teachings allow for the subjugation of 1.3 billion people who, like most people, are inclined to believe there is a God and that his prophets have spoken to man. But whereas Christianity asks its adherents to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to render unto God what is God's, Islam teaches that the Quran is the absolute word of God, not subject to interpretation. That to disagree with the 6,000-odd verses of the Quran that are organized into 114 chapters or surahs, or even reinterpret them is blasphemy punishable by death. Islamic authorities of all the major schools of Islam teach us that the Quran must be read so that the parts that were written last, rule over the other parts. They do not come last numerically in the Quran, since it is arranged so that the largest chapters are first and the smallest chapters are last. This so-called theory of abrogation requires that we look at the chapters of the Quran which were written after Muhammad went to Medina in 622 AD for guidance. So although there may be peaceful parts of the Quran, they do not guide what an adherent Muslim ought to believe. Now, this isn't often done, especially here in Washington. Let us look then at those chapters of the Quran written last, Surahs 9 and Surahs 5. Surah 9 holds, quote, "Fight and slay the unbelievers wherever ye find them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war. But if they repent and establish regular prayers and practice regular charity, then open the way for them. For Allah is oft forgiving, most merciful." That is Surah 9, verse 5. Another verse. "Fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by Allah and his apostle, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are of the 40 people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued." Surah 9, verse 29. Let me repeat that earlier one. "Fight and slay the unbelievers wherever ye find them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war." Surah 5. "O ye who believe, take not the Jews and the Christians for your friends and protectors. They are but friends and protectors to each other. And he amongst you that turns to them for friendship is of them. Verily, Allah guideth not the unjust." That is Surah 5, verse 51. Now, these are the most, I would say, radical, violent parts of the Quran. It is often said that anyone who picks out these, who cherry picks these, as it were, is picking them simply to demonstrate that the Quran is violent and that this is somehow unfair. But I would offer that we must understand Muslims as they understand themselves. They believe that the infidel, the non-believer, is to be made into a Muslim, or be killed, or to be subjugated by conceding sovereign authority and paying the jizya, or tax. To that end, they can lie to the infidel under the principle of taqiyya, that they should not be friends with him except as deception, and that they can kill the infidel. This is not, by the way, one man's interpretation. This exists in the book, the Quran, not subject to interpretation, except by punishment of death. If a Muslim says otherwise, it is for all practical purposes a lie meant to deceive us. For it is not our job to interpret Islam in ways that would make us feel better. Our job is to defend these United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Our job is to understand them again as they understand themselves. And it matters not whether the number of Muslims who actually believe this is 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 1.3 billion. We know it is believed by adherents to Islam who have taken up arms against the United States, who have operated as terrorists, and who control regimes abroad who are either sponsoring terrorism against the United States, like Saudi Arabia, or are building nuclear ballistic missiles, such as Iran. It is the doctrine of our enemy who is making war against us both here at home and abroad. In this country, they take the form of the Muslim Brotherhood and their organizational arms, such as the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Islamic Society of North America, the Muslim Student Associations, and others. Their job is to persuade American elites that Islam is a religion of peace. Documents obtained at the Holy Land trial in 2007 in Texas that investigated terrorist funding include the following from the Muslim Brotherhood's Strategic Memorandum on North American Affairs. They actually did a memorandum internally so that they understand internally what they're doing. They say in their internal memorandum, the general strategic goal of the group in America, this is straight from their document, the general strategic goal of the group in America, which was approved by the Shura Council and the Organizational Conference for the year 1987, is, quote, enablement of Islam in North America, meaning establishing an effective and stable Islamic movement led by the Muslim Brotherhood, which adopts Muslim causes domestically and globally, and which works to expand the observant Muslim base, aims at unifying and directing Muslims' efforts, presents Islam as a civilization alternative, and supports the global Islamic State wherever it is. Having established its leadership, the memorandum states that the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in North America, they continue to say, the process of settlement is civilization jihadist process with all the means. The Ikhwan, meaning the Muslim Brotherhood, they say, must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and by the hands of the believers, so that it is eliminated and Allah's religion is made victorious over all other religions. Again, this is coming from their document. They say without this level of understanding that their goal is the establishment of Islam here in North America, without this level of understanding, we are not up to this challenge and have not prepared ourselves for jihad yet. It is a Muslim's destiny to perform jihad and work wherever he is and wherever he lands until the final hour comes. And there is not escape from that destiny except for those who choose to slack. But would the slackers and the mujahideen be equal? End of quote. Again, if one were to ask the average Muslim if they know any of this, the answer would be no. Of course not. Indeed, very few would understand in the Muslim community the Quran with any level of detail. But what matters is that this is what the members of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States and within the Islamic world that are violent, this is what they believe. They who live in the United States, in fact, believe this. And they operate an influence operation here in the United States to have us believe that Islam is a religion of peace. We, of course, have evidence, not that I even need to mention it, of the first bombing of the World Trade Center, the attacks on September 11th, and isolated attacks, most recently at Fort Hood and elsewhere. More than anything else, because we're a free society and a liberal people in the best sense of that word, more than anything else, this notion that Islam is a religion of peace has cowed American policymakers to believing that Islam is a religion to be treated like any other religion. Indeed, to mention the threat of Islam as Islam is in any kind of serious way is to be labeled a bigot or a racist. Some of the groundbreaking work done on the threat of Islam was by Major Stephen Coughlin, who, while working as a lawyer for the Joint Staff in the Pentagon, tried to explain the ideological and practical threat Islam posed to the United States. This work led ultimately to the recent book, Sharia, The Threat to America, that was co-authored by Mr. Coughlin along with Frank Gaffney, Andrew McCarthy, Jim Woolsey, and other members of the national security community. I'd recommend that book to you. In it, we describe the threat that Islam presents to a free society, since we do not want to see our fellow countrymen as potential enemies of the state. We Americans don't think that way. We don't want to think that way. But part of our problem is that we really don't know how many Muslims there are in the United States. We don't know how big a problem this actually is. And to suggest that there may be a security threat raises these specious charges of bigotry, because it matters at some level just how many Muslims there are. Now, during the Bush administration, they used the number about 2.5 million Muslims. The Pew Research Center in 2007 estimated that there were 2.35 million Muslims in the United States. The Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, put the number at 5 million Muslims in 2000. President Obama, in his Cairo speech in June of 2009, put the number at 7 million. So there's quite a bit of discrepancy there. Other people I know think the number could be as high as 9 million. The Pew Research Center, again, which did that lower number, did a survey of opinions of Muslims in 2007, and they found a couple of interesting responses. And again, I say this not to vilify any Muslim. I say that simply to understand them as they're trying to understand themselves, and that we can look with clarity, moral clarity, at who they are and how we can live together. 8% of American Muslims, again, American Muslims, said that suicide bombing, 8% of the Muslims said that suicide bombing can sometimes be justified in defense of Islam. Now, the simple math, if we take a number such as 7 million that Mr. Obama said, that would be 560,000 people who live in the United States believe suicide bombing can be justified. Among Muslims aged 18 to 29, 15% believe that suicide bombing could be justified. And among this age group, 60% thought of themselves first as Muslim and second as American. And among all ages in that 2007 survey, 5% had a favorable view of al-Qaeda. Now, that we have not suffered another large-scale attack after September 11th is due in part to some fine work by law enforcement, but more likely the inability of the Muslim Brotherhood to capitalize on what they've built. And there is, I will say, the great uncertainty as to how Americans would react to widespread terrorism within the American heartland. Americans may be a very genteel people, but also a people whose passion for freedom could lead them to drastic measures. And I believe the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't quite know how we would react. In the meantime, this stealth jihad that is going on presents a threat to the United States that lingers just below the surface of public debate, and one that presents a unique challenge to both law enforcement throughout this country and to the U.S. intelligence community. It's one thing to have hundreds of individuals to deal with. What if that number is thousands, or tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of citizens whose allegiance is not to the United States, but to an operational form of Islam that seeks the destruction of the United States? We don't like to think in those terms. It will divide U.S. society, create animosity among citizens, and sap us of our focus against equally dangerous threats. Because whereas the Islamic threat here at home, which is yet to be fully realized, presents great danger, it is only one of other threats, including the Islamic threat, which is in fact existential in nature, from Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. So moving away from America to our threats abroad. Today in Iran, they enrich uranium that they will convert to plutonium, which they will use in a nuclear warhead someday. The Iranians, we think of them as backwards at times. They're not. They have advanced ballistic missiles, such as the Shahab-3, that they can launch from the land or from a ship off of our coast. The Iranians, the Islamic Republic of Iran, possesses missiles that can destroy an American city, or if they are able to deliver the warhead as an electromagnetic pulse weapon, they will destroy the electronic infrastructure of the United States that could result in the deaths of hundreds of millions of Americans. Again, this is from a country that believes it must destroy the infidel with every stratagem of war. We do not yet today have a missile defense to defend these United States from this ship-launched attack or from an attack from China and Russia. So they say their purpose is to destroy us with every stratagem of war. They build ballistic missiles. And what do we do in return? How can we thought to be serious about our national defense, we Americans, when we will not defend us from such a ship-launched attack or from a nuclear attack by the Chinese or the Russians? This is in part because not merely do we misunderstand Islam, we seem no longer to understand superpower conflicts. Consider here China. We trade with China and they buy our debt. Indeed, they have $2 trillion in U.S. reserves, about $1.1 trillion of which is in U.S. treasuries. Their economies and ours are intimately intertwined. They would never go to war with us, it is thought, because that would be to destroy their main export market. And despite their intense desire to reunify with the free people of Taiwan, who they consider a renegade province, it is said that the Chinese will never fight Chinese. But they are building an advanced army, navy, air force, and space-based capability to limit the United States and our ability to project power in Asia. The Chinese today have 2 million men under arms, and although their navy and air force is not as sophisticated as the United States or Russia, they still possess an untold number of ICBMs, most of which are aimed at the United States, and hundreds of short and medium-range missiles for use in an Asian theater of combat. Chinese military thinking is openly anti-American. In their military journals, they write openly about such strategies as unrestricted warfare, using a combination of traditional military means along with cyber warfare, economic warfare, atomic warfare, and terrorism. This is what they write in their military journals. They're also working to develop a space-based military capability. They are investing in various launch vehicles, including manned spaceflight, a space station, and extensive anti-satellite weaponry meant to negate the United States' global satellite coverage. They, like Russia, will do everything in their power to discourage the United States from deploying things such as missile defenses that could stop the Chinese nuclear capability and the ability of China to operate at will in the Pacific. Absent a missile defense that we currently do not possess that can stop Chinese ballistic missiles, the U.S. will be hard-pressed to maintain security commitments in Asia, given the advances China has made to its offensive nuclear forces. The U.S. 7th Fleet, however capable, cannot withstand the kind of nuclear missiles and nuclear-tipped cruise missiles that China could employ against it. The destructive capability of the Chinese DF-21D against our aircraft carriers can raise the stakes of a conflict in the South China Sea that would not portend well for the United States. The Chinese have studied American capabilities for the past 20 years and have built offensive weapons meant to negate our previous advantages. Whether or not these Chinese advances are indeed effective is unknown, but what we do know is that the United States has not taken, in my view, adequate steps to modernize our forces to meet the ballistic and cruise missile threats of our enemies. The SSN-22 cruise missile, called the Sunburn cruise missile, which was designed by the Russians and deployed by the Chinese and Iranians, presents a technological challenge because of its Mach 3 speed and enormous size. These are physical problems in time and space that very smart people try to figure out and do something about. The Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, they have thought about these problems. They have tried to solve these problems to their advantage. Now that's at the level of capability. What of intent? China has for some time carried out a policy of what has been termed the peaceful rise of China. They possess a growing economy and a growing military power, but with no clear intent of being an aggressive power. That's what we've seen so far. But what we've seen lately is the rise of what scholars such as Tong Ben have termed the Red Guard generation. These are the generals that are about 50 to 65 years old, who grew up during the Cultural Revolution and who are now taking the reins of the Chinese military. They are no longer interested in communist China being a secondary power in the eyes of the world, and they believe themselves that they can match their economic power with military assertiveness. Now, this can manifest itself by a desire to take back Taiwan by force, avenge themselves of the wrongs done them by Imperial Japan, or remove the United States as the preeminent military power in the world. However far-fetched this may seem to the American policymaker sitting not very far from here, it is widely held that America is a superpower on the decline, with economic problems that will limit our ability to modernize our military and maintain our alliances around the world. One can see in the Washington Post today talk of cutting back our defense procurements. And because America lacks adequate conventional military means to wage war against a country as large as China, it is thought the U.S. would have to resort to full-scale nuclear war to defend its Asian allies from an attack by China. This is a prospect that caused Mao Zedong to term the United States a paper tiger, that although we possess economic and military power, we will not use them to our advantage. Now, this may only have been propaganda, and I'm not saying I believe that. But current Chinese aggression against Japan in the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, and their open assistance of the Iranian nuclear program, as well as sale of arms to the Taliban in Afghanistan by the Chinese, would suggest that the Communist Chinese seek to marginalize the United States and to play the role that the Soviet Union once played as sponsor of global revolution against the West. Which brings us finally to Russia and the degradation of strategic thinking during and after the Cold War and in this age of nuclear weapons. We used to be guided by the principle that the central strategic objective of the United States is the prevention of direct attack upon the United States. That was simple and straightforward. For the past 50 years, we've been taught something different, that great power politics is beyond the grasp of ordinary policymakers or even generals, that we must understand the balance of power between nations such as the United States and Russia, especially since we possess nuclear ballistic missiles, that America cannot seek superiority over other nations, lest we create strategic instability. That is the common view expounded by universities, think tanks, and schools of foreign service. There is the collective view, and I exaggerate only slightly, that America is hardly worth defending, or any way that American military power is fundamentally suspect. And far from a fringe point of view, these people occupy the foreign policy and national security establishment of this country. But you will say these are the intellectual shortcomings of the left, perhaps. Conservatives, for their part, have been basking in the glow of winning the Cold War, a war, I will say, not to be won. So mentally invested in the victory, conservatives failed to appreciate that we did not disarm the Russians of their nuclear arsenal. We did not stop their active measures to undermine America and the West, nor did we create a liberal democracy in Russia. What then was winning the Cold War all about? And why should it be celebrated so constantly? For the past 2 decades, we paid the Russians to dismantle nuclear warheads they would have dismantled anyway. All the while, they used those resources to modernize their ballistic missile arsenal. We, on the other hand, we Americans, have not tested a nuclear warhead since 1992. So to be clear, we don't even know exactly if they work. We have no more tactical nuclear weapons, thinking that superpower conflict or even any serious challenge would not come to the United States. Nor did we build the missile defense promised by Ronald Reagan, since this was no longer necessary, since, of course, we won the Cold War. Instead, we prefer to stay vulnerable to our enemies when we know we have the ability to prevent their nuclear arsenals from destroying or keeping us hostage. This was true under Republican and Democratic administrations alike, including the last one. Why does missile defense matter, you ask? It seems like a specialty issue, doesn't it? Kind of like the national security equivalent of the flat tax. But of course, it is not merely a specialty issue, it is the singular issue upon which our national security must hinge, because so long as the Russians possess offensive weapons that can destroy us, we must substantially accede to their demands, lest we escalate tensions to full-scale thermonuclear war, which I hasten to add we will not do. It is said that every war is a moral struggle, moral in that it involves life and death, the forcible requisition of men and materials used to wage war, and ultimately victory or defeat. And although the Cold War is said to have been won by the West, it was not so much a victory as an interlude, and we would do well to get on with the crisis at hand. For instance, the Senate just ratified the New START Treaty that will reduce our nuclear arsenal and will likely cause us to further delay the building of missile defense, because now to build missile defense would be somehow to sour our relations with the Russians. Perhaps the question ought to be asked, what is the morality of signing a treaty with a nation such as Russia that engages in massive deception against the United States, supports our enemies abroad, and builds ever more advanced nuclear weapons whose purpose is the blackmail or destruction of the United States. The debate over the New START Treaty might have been easier if it were merely deficiencies in the language, restrictions on missile defense, and the unverifiability of nuclear inspections. Something more insidious is at work, as the desire to ratify New START reveals both the moral bankruptcy of a foreign policy establishment of this country and an extraordinary amount of self-deception by the people who know better. At the heart of our strategic defense today is the notion that we will use massive nuclear retaliation against a nuclear power that attacked us. But absent the reliability of our nuclear arsenal and a smaller nuclear arsenal, how can such a strategy work? Today we possess an aging nuclear force that we are not really sure will work if we had to use it to retaliate to Russian, Chinese, Iranian, North Korean, or an undetermined rogue attack. So perilous is this lack of modernization of our current nuclear arsenal that the Obama administration believed it could induce Senator John Kyle into leading the charge for approval of New START. Senator Kyle thankfully knew better and did his best to stop it. New START, just so that we're clear about this, will not modernize a single warhead within our arsenal, but will instead create the illusion that America is better defended. After all, is that not the point? Why does one not make a treaty? So that they're better off after the treaty. The question of nuclear modernization of our arsenal should be debated, hearings should be held on it, and we should look at the condition of our nuclear force and take whatever steps are necessary to ensure our nuclear deterrent. Second, it's not at all clear that fewer weapons will make us safer. As strategists have often warned, fewer nuclear weapons is likely to encourage other nations to build nuclear weapons themselves rather than to discourage them. Catching up to the United States is a powerful incentive if one wants to dictate world affairs to their liking. Third, the Russians make this treaty because they do not engage in a single act of foreign policy without consideration of what will give them a global advantage over the United States and its allies in the West. New START is no different. The Russians today wish us to reduce our nuclear arsenal and to forego missile defense. They, on the other hand, are modernizing their forces and possess themselves a crude system of missile defense using surface-to-air missiles with nuclear-tipped interceptors. We have no way of knowing today how advanced the Russian offensive force is and has become, or how detailed their missile defenses have evolved to. But even in well-meaning policy circles, Russia is thought not to be an adversary. Even the Wall Street Journal says Russia is not an adversary. Russia wanted that treaty because it gives them strategic advantage. And the United States today will not even contemplate building missile defenses to stop a Russian or Chinese nuclear missile aimed at the United States. The argument is made that limiting our nuclear arsenal and not developing new and better nuclear weapons gives us the moral high ground in dealing with other nations. Really? Can a nation like ours be said to have nuclear superiority when in fact we won't do the most basic constitutional duty and provide for the common defense of our people by building a robust missile defense? Missile defense is referred to these days as if we already have one. And I'll say this again, we cannot stop a single Russian or Chinese ballistic missile, nor are we planning to build a system that will stop a Russian or Chinese missile. This is a fact unknown to many Americans and unspoken by many American policymakers for fear of the rightful anger it would engender in American citizens. If there is any more profound moral statement a country is willing to make than that they willingly, knowingly, and purposely keep their citizenry vulnerable to enemy missile attack because of the morally corrupt notion that it is better to engage in full-scale nuclear war rather than build a defense against such weapons. Let me say in conclusion that if we're not going to defend the American people from these many threats, we ought to tell them. That is the candor due of free people. Now, what I said sounded like bad news. I don't mean it to be, because If the American people actually understand these facts, if their elected representatives actually tell them these facts, I think they will demand something be done, and something be done quickly. We have the technology to build missile defenses to stop an Iranian ballistic missile, a North Korean ballistic missile, which we can somewhat today. And we have the technology to build missile defenses against Russia and China. Today we don't do that. There's something unconscionable about that, which, if explained to the American people, I believe they will rise up in anger, an anger that will rival the Tea Party anger over the mismanagement of our economy and Obamacare and other problems today. So I want to thank you for listening to all that, and I'd be happy to take your questions. Yes, sir.
Well, Dr. Kennedy, first of all, thank you very much for your sobering comments. I'm not sure if I'm nervous about your comments or scared about them or not. I was speaking with my 17-year-old son, and he said that Islam wants to either kill us or kill us. So what do you mean by that? He said they either want to change our spirit, our morality as we live, or they want to kill us as we die.
Right.
The Heritage Foundation has 33 minutes, which I think is an excellent resource
Right.
for those that are not aware of it.
Yeah.
But will you do me a favor, please, and comment on whether or not you think that our political, or what you think our political liberal leaders, such as Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, what do you think their end game is for the United States 10 years from now, maybe 15 years from now? What do you think they hope that we look like? Because for me, it's a scary picture. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that question. And I agree with your son. Islam is a real danger, as I've tried to explain. The political left in America, I think, doesn't worry about national security because they think the political right is worrying about national security. And an unfortunate thing is that the Democrats in this country used to concern themselves with national security. They were anti-communist. And unfortunately, they moved away from that to purely social issues. And I think they believe that Republicans, when there's really a crisis, will figure out what weapon system to build or something else. I myself believe that my remarks were not aimed at them. I don't expect them to do these hard things. But I do expect Republicans to take this seriously. And there's a lot to worry about. The title of the panel was about it's not just the economy. And I think we mean to say to Republicans, and to Democrats, but Republicans especially, this is something to be worried about. We want to create jobs, absolutely. But we also must provide for the common defense. That is among the first requirements. And a time will come, in my judgment, where you will have a Chinese general who wants to do something because he's tired of being thought of as secondary. And he will have ambition. If there's one thing we've learned, that men desire glory, whether that happens in the boardroom or elsewhere, could happen in the war room. Is there a Chinese general who thinks of putting China on top of the world? Are there people sitting in rooms like this in Beijing or Moscow or Tehran or Damascus who are figuring out how do we make our power the preeminent power? We on the right need to take that seriously because I think they're taking that seriously. Yes, sir. The microphone's coming over here.
For at least a month, we have heard Senator Chavez talk about a treaty with Iran, which will put Iran's missiles in Venezuela. But I have heard from neither side any mention of the Monroe Doctrine. Would you comment?
Well, thank you for mentioning the Monroe Doctrine. That's John Quincy Adams would be proud. That is a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelans should not be allowed to make treaties with powers outside of our hemisphere to build weapons aimed at the United States. It is a sign, as I say, of our moral bankruptcy that no one even raises the notion of the Monroe Doctrine, that no one would seriously say, that's not going to happen. Say it publicly. Say it to the American people. Much of our diplomacy is done in private after WikiLeaks. I'm not sure how much of it, but it's worth telling the American people things with candor. On the economy, if we're bankrupt, tell them that. If we can't afford certain things, tell them that. If we have enemies, tell them that. Yes, the Monroe Doctrine. Don't let people in our hemisphere. That seems to be an outrage. Where are the people, the question about the left, I expect no one on the left to say that. Where are the people on the right saying what you just said? Excellent point. Yes, sir.
I originally studied applying to graduate school about the electronic magnetic pulse bomb.
Right.
And I'm really concerned that that's more dangerous than any nuclear bomb to me, because if it's used, it would fry every electronic component. Transportation would fail, distribution, whole communities could starve to death because nothing could be transported. I read too that they said the military was more equipped to handle EMP, but I could see, well, I doubt our capabilities to protect ourselves on the military side as well as the, just like Washington D.C., one was to be exploded. How would that impact our nation?
That's an excellent question. The question really is, one can take a nuclear missile, launch it in the high atmosphere, say 300 kilometers above the Earth, and create an electromagnetic pulse. In the vacuum of space, there's no fireball explosion like there would be in the lower atmosphere. It's just a pulse. But this pulse destroys all electronics by destroying the transformers that distribute power through the United States. So if an electromagnetic pulse bomb went off, say, over Chicago, and line of sight covered the entire United States, the transformers are all destroyed and a lot of simple wiring is destroyed. Your cell phone might turn on, but the lights in this building go out, right? The elevators won't work. Your car may or may not work. You're walking home today. When you get home, your refrigerator won't be working. You won't have water because the water is pumped electronically. You have enough food and water for about 3 days in your house if you're like the typical American. After that, you run out of food. The stores run out of food after about 3 days or a week. The Electromagnetic Pulse Commission, a commission convened by Congress, thought that the industrial infrastructure of the United States, absent electricity, can support life here for about 30 million people. We're a country of over 300. What happens to those other people? They don't have food or water. It's a horrible weapon, this electromagnetic pulse weapon. It was thought during the Cold War that we would do that to the Russians and the Russians would do that to us. Today, the Iranians are building nuclear weapons. They have practiced twice in the Caspian Sea, launching a ballistic missile from a ship. So the Iranians practicing in the Caspian Sea, launching a ballistic missile from a ship which someday could be off of our coast. When they practiced this in the Caspian Sea, the missile was not used to go up and then re-enter the atmosphere to simulate a nuclear warhead. The dummy warhead was exploded in the high atmosphere to simulate an electromagnetic pulse bomb. So it's not a secret. The Iranians are practicing this. Now, in the face of this, two things can happen. You can either build a missile defense that would stop such a weapon, or you could harden the system. I would advocate that you should do both. You could build a robust missile defense because you will defend us from not merely the Iranians, but you will defend us from the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans or anyone else. But also harden the system, because given just natural solar occurrences, there may come a time when we need, just technologically, a more robust electronic system. That's a very good question, and it seems like just such a common sense. I tell this to many Americans, some of these things, and they all look at me as if I'm the master of the bleeding obvious, right? It seems like such common sense that if you have enemies practicing to destroy you, why wouldn't you figure out ways of preventing that? Because we have an alternative, by the way. If we know that the Iranians did that to us, if it actually happened, we would have 200 million Americans dead, potentially. We would have the option of then trying to obliterate 75 million Iranians. What good would that do? What comfort would that give your starving child? None. Build a robust missile defense. We have it within our budget to do. As broke as the United States is today, we can afford that. The technological advances we would achieve just by doing that, the technological advances our economy enjoys today were much because of the aerospace program of the 1960s and 70s. This would actually be a program that would employ people and defend the United States. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy. Back in the Clinton administration, there was talk of sharing technological information with the Chinese. Nothing much ever boiled to the surface in objection or outrage to that. Can you measure today what the consequences of that sharing of technology was with the Chinese?
The question is, during the Clinton administration, we transferred a lot of technology from American aerospace to the Chinese. And it did improve their ability to both miniaturize their nuclear warheads, and it improved their guidance systems. The combination of those things puts our fleet at risk in the South China Sea, should we try to project power there. With smaller warheads and better guidance systems, one can find on the water aircraft carriers and battle groups. And those aircraft carriers and battle groups have some missile defenses, but not adequate. And these advanced Chinese missiles, both nuclear ballistic missiles, but also nuclear-tipped cruise missiles that they're able to use with that technology, have made the Chinese into a very formidable force. I don't mean to paint the United States as backwards or incapable. It's just that we've not kept up with some of their developments. We can catch up, by the way. That should be our business. We should tell Americans as a free people that they can be defended, that they will be defended, that they should be defended. And I believe the American people will rise to that challenge. But the Chinese are very hardworking, they're very creative, and they mean to challenge us in the world. Yes, sir, in the back. Yes, you.
The immigration component, you mentioned the Islamic immigration threat. What about the Chinese-American immigration threat? Because there's been so much espionage that's come out, both industrial and military, from Chinese-Americans.
Yeah, the Chinese-American immigration and the potential for espionage. We live in a free society. I don't expect we keep many secrets. I don't expect us to keep many secrets. I think that's okay. I think it's good to be transparent. I think, as I say, I think it's good to tell the American people today they're undefended. Because if you tell them they're undefended, they'll demand defense. If America has a strong Army, Navy, Air Force, and missile defense, that need not be kept a secret. I don't think there's anything we can keep secret from our enemies, for instance. You live in a free society, they're going to find things out. There's the internet, there's WikiLeaks, there's always going to be espionage. I don't think it needs to be Chinese Americans that actually move here to sell our secrets. I think any American, or excuse me, an American of any race might sell our secrets. People will do such things. In the history of espionage, it's not been so ethnically motivated as simply there are some people who wish to betray the country. I think we can build the kind of defenses that can overcome whatever espionage may be waged against us. And I doubt sincerely in our history we kept very many secrets. I believe the Russians and the Chinese have always known almost everything we were trying to do. We have a tremendous capacity for deception, but unfortunately that's mostly self-deception at the highest levels. Yes, ma'am.
You used the term earlier, military establishment, and I was wondering if you could comment on why there hasn't been more demand within the generals and the Joint Chiefs of Staff to demand more funding for exploration into these programs and defense measures. If it's merely politics, if it's a blind optimism, or if you could give some other reason that there might be.
The question is, why aren't the generals raising more of a stink about this? That's an excellent question. That's a hard one, because you look at these generals and they put their lives on the line, and they're good men and they're decent, and they've done some great things for our country. But you ask them sometimes to think about politics, and it doesn't go so well. Look at all the generals that were in favor of the New START Treaty. Look at the number of generals who were for a world without nuclear weapons. That just because you're a general and you put your life on the line doesn't mean you understand all the nuances of strategy, or that you're going to be in the business of demanding these things. I think we give too much credence, I think, to generals and to military experts about such matters. That I think if you ask the average citizen in Kansas what should be done to defend him, he will tell you whatever is necessary. Find out what our enemies are doing and make sure we can stop that. We send people to Congress to figure these things out. We shouldn't have to ask generals. Most of the things I told you, almost everything I told you, you can read in a newspaper. Some newspaper somewhere said what I said today. It talked about the Chinese. It talked about their views. You could read the Chinese military journals, right? You could read about advancements in the literature, in the actual aerospace literature, about Russian missiles. You could find out from Iranians in congressional hearings what they're doing in their nuclear programs. We know these things. We send people to Congress to study these things, to debate them, and to build defenses for us. And so let's not rely on the generals, because I don't think there's any generals in this room, but I think your own common sense could tell you that we have enemies and we have to meet those challenges. We have time for one more question. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, apart from the battle over increasing the defense budget, what about cutting some of the things we're already spending money on to build up China, like military exchanges, exporting from bank loans, etc.?
We want to be very careful about any kind of expenditures that are unnecessary with the Chinese and within the Pentagon themselves. My colleague Mark Halperin mentioned recently in the Wall Street Journal, if there's a wasteful expenditure in the Pentagon, we should cut it. Absolutely. On the other hand, if there's something we need, we must absolutely fund that too. How much should we spend on our national defense as a percentage? Some people throw around numbers. 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%. What's the number? I would say it could be 100%. It could be whatever it takes to keep us a free people. Now, it won't have to be 100%. That's ridiculous, right? But we should figure out whatever it takes to make sure that the Russians, the Chinese, and the Islamic world believe that it would be a bad idea to try to destroy the United States. And if we do that, by the way, I don't think we'll have to spend as much, that they'll be discouraged. They don't want to fight a war with the United States. That's a bad idea. We simply need to tell the people of the United States what will be required for their national defense. I want to thank you for listening to me. I want to thank Hillsdale College for inviting me. And there's a lot to do, and I thank you for your attention. Thanks.